She was 19 years old, sold by her own father to a stranger she had never met, to settle a debt. The carriage dropped her at a lonely cabin in the middle of nowhere. No wedding, no ceremony, just a transaction completed. That night, Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, trembling. She knew what happened on wedding nights. She had heard the stories. She was prepared to endure whatever she had to endure. Then the man did something that shattered everything she believed. He spread a blanket on the cold, hard floor. He lay down with his back to her. And he went to sleep. He never touched her. He never demanded anything. He gave her something no one had ever given her before. Choice. But when the town found out he slept on the floor, they laughed. They called her so worthless that even her own husband couldn't bear to touch her. And one midnight she packed her bag and tried to run, believing she was doing him a favor. What he said when he caught her in that barn? It will break your heart wide open. Love doesn't always speak in words. Sometimes it speaks through the fire built before you wake, the path cleared so you won't stumble, and the choice given when the world says you deserve none. This story proves that your worth isn't determined by how you were sold, but by who chooses to stay. And sometimes the quietest love is the deepest. If you believe that everyone deserves to be chosen, not bought, hit subscribe. Comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. Share this with someone who needs to know they are worth waiting for. The wind had a name in this part of the country. It was not a gentle name whispered by lovers. It was a harsh, grating name spoken by farmers with cracked lips and sun-damaged skin. It was a wind that carried no relief, only the fine red dust of the plains and the scent of sun-baked earth. For 3 days, this wind had been Evelyn's only constant companion. It whipped at the canvas cover of the carriage. It worked its way through the seams of her simple wool dress. It left a gritty film on her skin that she could not wash away, no matter how hard she tried. She sat with her back straight on the hard wooden bench. Her hands were clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned to pale stones. She was 19 years old. At 19, other girls in the small, damp town she had left behind were thinking of dances. They were dreaming of ribbons for their hair. They were stealing glances with boys who worked at the mercantile and blushing when those boys looked back. Evelyn was thinking of the finality of the horizon. It stretched on forever, a relentless, unbroken line where a pale, washed-out sky met an ocean of brown, dying grass. This was her new home, a place without boundaries. Yet she had never felt more like a prisoner. The arrangement, as her father had called it, had been made with the grim practicality of a livestock sale. There was no romance in it, only desperation, a failed crop, a debt that had grown like a cancer, a long, unforgiving winter looming ahead. These things had sealed her fate. Her father was a man whose hands had once been gentle. Now they were gnarled with worry and hard labor. He had not been able to meet her eyes when he told her the news. He had mumbled his words while staring at a loose floorboard. He said the man was good. He said the man was a hard worker. He said the man had land. Then he said the words that would haunt her for months to come. He said she would be provided for. Provided for. The phrase echoed now in the rhythmic creak of the carriage wheels. It was the same term used for a horse given a dry stall and a measure of oats. She was a debt settled, a mouth her family no longer had to feed. She understood the necessity of it. She truly did. She had seen the fear in her mother's eyes night after night. She had watched her mother portion out the cornmeal as if it were gold dust. She had heard her younger siblings cry from hunger pains they were too young to understand. Love in her world was not about whispered promises. It was about survival. And her survival, it seemed, had been bartered for the survival of her family. She did not blame them. How could she? They were doing what they had to do, just as she was doing what she had to do. But understanding something and accepting it are two very different things. Evelyn had never been courted. She had never held a boy's hand beneath a summer moon. She had never felt the warmth of a kind gaze meant only for her. The world of men, as she knew it, was a world of gruff commands, of tired sighs, of the smell of sweat and soil and exhaustion. Tenderness was a luxury in her life. It was as foreign as silk sheets or porcelain dolls. These were things that existed in stories, not in the dirt-floor cabin where she had grown up. Her heart was a still, quiet place, untouched by the flutters and fevers she had heard other girls whisper about behind the schoolhouse. It was a place she had learned to keep locked away. For what good was a soft heart in a hard world? All it did was get bruised. The driver was a taciturn man named Silas. He had a tobacco-stained beard and eyes that had seen too many miles of empty road. He had not spoken more than a dozen words to her during the entire 3-day journey. Once he had pointed out a distant smudge of trees on the horizon. He had said that cottonwoods meant water. That was the closest thing to conversation they had shared. Mostly he just drove, his reins held loosely in his gloved hands, his presence as unremarkable as the dust devils that danced across the plains. Now, without warning, the carriage jolted to a stop. The sudden silence was more jarring than the constant noise had been. The only sound was the incessant wind whistling a mournful tune around the corners of the carriage. Evelyn's heart, which had been a dull, steady drum of anxiety for 3 days, began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She took a shallow breath. The air was thick with heat and dust. She did not move. It felt as if moving would make it real. As long as she sat here in the dim, stuffy confines of this carriage, she was still just a girl on a journey. The moment her foot touched that foreign soil, she would become something else entirely. A wife, to a man she had never met, in a place she had never seen, for the rest of her life. After a long moment, Silas cleared his throat. His voice was a low rumble when he spoke. He said the man was coming. Slowly, forcing her rigid fingers to unclench, Evelyn leaned forward and pushed aside the canvas flap. The light was blinding. She blinked rapidly, her eyes watering from the sudden assault of brightness. When her vision finally cleared, she saw what would become her entire world. Before her stood a small, sturdy cabin built of rough-hewn logs. It was chinked with mud and straw. It looked as though it had grown out of the earth itself, hunkered down low to brace against the relentless wind. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney. It was the only sign of life in this vast emptiness. Beside the cabin stood a barn. Its wood had weathered to a silver gray that spoke of many hard winters survived. Beyond that, there was nothing. Nothing but the endless undulating land. It had been plowed into neat, dark furrows that stretched toward the horizon like the lines on an old man's face. Row after row after row, the work of years, the work of one man's hands. And then she saw him. He was not standing on the porch to greet her like a bridegroom might greet his bride. He was walking from the direction of the barn. He was wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his trousers as if this were just another ordinary day. He moved with an unhurried, deliberate pace. His shoulders were broad under a faded linen shirt. He was tall. But the vastness of the land seemed to diminish even him. As he drew closer, Evelyn took in the details with the sharp, terrified clarity of a cornered animal. His name was Caleb. That was all she knew. Caleb Thorne. His face was not unkind, but it was a fortress, weathered and tanned by countless days under the unforgiving sun. It was carved with lines of labor rather than laughter. His jaw was firm. His mouth was a straight, unsmiling line. His hair was the color of dark soil. It was long enough to brush the collar of his shirt. It moved slightly in the wind. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, clear blue, the color of the sky on a cold winter morning. They seemed to absorb the light without reflecting any of it back. They looked at her now, not with welcome, not with desire, not even with curiosity. They looked at her with a flat, assessing gaze. It was the look a man gives a field he must plow, or a tool he must mend. It was a look of practicality, devoid of all emotion. There was a strength in him, a solid, rooted quality, like an old oak that had withstood 100 storms and would withstand 100 more. But there was no warmth. He was a man made of earth and stone and silence. And he was her husband. Silas climbed down from his seat. His joints cracked in protest after 3 days of sitting. He spoke to Caleb in a low voice that Evelyn could barely hear. He said he had brought her safe, just as promised. Caleb gave one curt nod. He reached into his pocket. A few coins changed hands. The exchange was quick and quiet, like any other simple business transaction, like the purchase of a plow or a sack of seed, like the purchase of a wife. Silas set Evelyn's small canvas satchel on the ground. It contained everything she owned in this world: a second dress, a hairbrush that had belonged to her grandmother, a Bible with pressed flowers between its pages. Her entire life fit into a bag she could carry with one hand. Silas tipped his hat to Caleb. He did not look at Evelyn. He climbed back onto the carriage and drove away. The carriage disappeared into a cloud of red dust. It took with it the last living connection to the world Evelyn had known, the last link to her family, to her home, to everything familiar. The silence that followed was immense. The land stretched around her in every direction. Empty, unforgiving, endless. She had never felt so alone. She remained frozen on the wooden bench of the now empty carriage platform. She could not seem to make her legs move. Finally, Caleb spoke. His voice was deep and steady. There was no softness in it, no warmth, just simple, practical words. He told her she could get out now. It was not a request. It was not an invitation. It was simply the next step in a transaction that had already been completed without her consent. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else as she gathered her skirts and climbed down. The dirt shifted beneath her boots. She stood there, small and uncertain, while he picked up her satchel as if it weighed nothing. He turned toward the cabin without looking back. Then he spoke again. 2 words. He said to follow. She did. Each step felt like a march toward something final, something she could never take back. There was no wedding, no preacher standing beneath a flower-covered arch, no witnesses dabbing their eyes with handkerchiefs, no music, no flowers, no celebration. Her marriage was this: a silent walk from a dusty carriage to a cabin door, a transaction completed, a life sold, and a girl who had no idea that everything she believed about her future was about to be proven wrong. Inside the cabin, the air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and pine. After the relentless heat of the journey, it felt almost like mercy. The space was simple and clean. A stone hearth glowed softly against the far wall. A solid wooden table stood in the center of the room with 2 chairs tucked beneath it. There was a shelf with a few tin plates and cups. A small window let in the fading afternoon light. Against the far wall, there was a bed. Evelyn's eyes fixed on it immediately. Her breath caught in her throat. The bed was covered with a faded quilt in blues and browns. It was neatly made. The pillows were plump and clean. It looked like a sentence waiting to be carried out. She knew what happened on wedding nights. She had heard the older girls whispering about it with red cheeks and nervous giggles. She had heard her mother crying softly through thin walls more than once. It was the price of being a wife, the duty she would have to perform. Her hands began to tremble and to vow. Caleb moved as if she were not there. He crossed to the hearth and stirred a pot that hung over the low flames. Without looking at her, he spoke. He said there was food. He told her to sit. She sat because he told her to sit. There seemed to be nothing else she could do. Her legs were grateful for the rest. He ladled stew into 2 tin bowls and set one before her. The contents smelled of venison and root vegetables. It looked hearty and filling, but fear had stolen all flavor from her mouth. She forced herself to eat anyway. Spoonful by spoonful, the food turned to ash on her tongue. They ate in complete silence. Evelyn could hear her own heartbeat. It was louder than the crackle of the fire. She could hear the wind outside, still howling its mournful song. She could hear the scrape of his spoon against the tin bowl. She could not hear him breathing. He was that quiet. When he finished eating, he washed both bowls in a basin of water and set them aside to dry. His movements were efficient and practiced, the movements of a man who had lived alone for a very long time. Then he spoke again. He said he needed to check on the animals before dark. He stepped outside without another word. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Evelyn was alone. The waiting was worse than anything she had imagined. The bed loomed in the dim light, a constant reminder of what she believed was coming. She had heard stories, terrible stories, stories of wedding nights that left girls weeping until dawn, stories of men who were rough and demanding and took what they wanted without care for anything else. She did not know what kind of man Caleb Thorne was. She did not know if he would be gentle or cruel, kind or brutal. All she knew was that she had been sold to him, and sold things did not get to say no. Her hands shook as she changed into her plain nightgown. It was thin and worn. She had no fancy wedding clothes, no silk, no lace. Just simple cotton that had been washed so many times it was nearly transparent. She sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at the floor. Her fingers twisted together in her lap. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her temples. She thought about praying. But what would she pray for? To be treated gently? To survive? To somehow escape a fate that had already been sealed? God had not listened to her prayers before. She did not expect him to start now. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, the door opened. Evelyn flinched at the sound. Her whole body went rigid. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, unable to look up. She heard him move across the room. She heard him add a log to the fire. She heard the flames crackle and pop. Then she heard his footsteps approaching. She squeezed her eyes shut. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. This was it. This was the moment she had been dreading since her father told her about the arrangement. She waited for his hand on her shoulder. She waited for him to push her back onto the bed. She waited for the weight of him pressing down on her. But none of that happened. Instead, she heard him walk past her. She heard the creak of the wooden chest at the foot of the bed. She heard fabric rustling. Slowly, cautiously, she opened her eyes. Caleb Thorne was spreading a blanket on the floor. Right there, on the hard wooden planks in front of the hearth. She watched in confusion as he lay down on his back. He pulled the blanket up to his chest. He folded his hands over his stomach. Then he turned onto his side, away from her, his back facing the bed. He did not speak. He did not touch her. He did not even look at her. He simply went to sleep, on the floor, like a man who expected nothing, like a man who demanded nothing. Evelyn sat frozen on the edge of the bed. She could not move. She could not breathe. She could not understand what was happening. She had prepared herself for pain. She had prepared herself for tears. She had prepared herself to endure whatever she had to endure, because that was what women did. She had not prepared herself for this, for kindness, for consideration, for a man who would choose the cold, hard floor over claiming what was legally his. The realization settled over her slowly, like the first frost of winter. He was not coming to the bed. He was not going to touch her. He was not going to demand anything from her tonight. He had given her something she had never expected to receive. He had given her choice. He had given her space. He had given her time. In a world where she had been sold like property, this silent, stoic man had given her dignity. The kindness of it struck her harder than cruelty ever could. Something broke inside her then, something that had been holding together by threads for 3 long days. Something that had been holding together for 3 long years, if she was being honest. The tears came before she could stop them. They slid silently down her cheeks and soaked into her pillow. She pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from making any sound. She did not want him to hear. She did not want him to know. She cried for her mother. She cried for her father. She cried for the life she had left behind and would never see again. But mostly, she cried because she had been ready for the worst. And instead, she had received a mercy she did not know how to process. She fell asleep with tears still wet on her face. The last thing she saw before darkness took her was the steady rise and fall of his shoulder beneath the blanket. He never stirred. He never looked back. But somehow, that silent presence on the floor beside the fire was the safest she had felt in months. When morning light crept through the small window, Evelyn woke slowly. For a moment, she forgot where she was. She reached for the familiar feel of her sisters beside her in the bed they had shared since childhood. But her hands found only empty space. Then memory came flooding back. The carriage, the cabin, the man on the floor. She sat up quickly and looked toward the hearth. He was gone. The blanket was folded neatly on top of the wooden chest. It had perfect corners and crisp edges, like he had done this 1,000 times before. Through the small window, she could see him already in the distance. He was walking toward the barn with a tool over his shoulder. The morning sun turned his dark hair almost golden. Something inside Evelyn had shifted overnight. She did not yet understand what it meant. But she knew with a certainty that surprised her that she had been wrong about something. This silent man with his fortress face and his cold blue eyes was not what she had expected. He was not what she had feared. And maybe, just maybe, this life she had dreaded might not be the prison she had imagined. She rose from the bed and smoothed down her nightgown. There was work to be done. Whatever this marriage was or was not going to be, she was still a wife. And wives had duties. She would earn her keep. She would be useful. She would give him no reason to regret the coins he had paid to bring her here. It was the least she could do for a man who had given her a mercy she had never expected to receive. The days that followed would teach her many things. About this land, about this cabin, about this man who spoke in silences and showed his heart through actions rather than words. But she did not know any of that yet. All she knew, as she started the fire and began her first full day as Evelyn Thorne, was that she had survived the first night. And sometimes survival was enough. The days that followed fell into a quiet pattern. It was not a comfortable rhythm at first. It was the cautious dance of two strangers sharing a space neither of them had chosen. Evelyn cooked. Caleb worked. They ate their meals in silence. Every night, without fail, he spread his blanket on the floor and turned his back to her. He never explained why. She never asked. The silence between them was not hostile. It was simply vast, an ocean of unspoken words that neither of them knew how to navigate. Evelyn had grown up in noise. Her family's cabin had been filled with the chatter of younger siblings, the hum of her mother's singing, the creak of floorboards under too many feet. Silence had been rare, precious, something to be stolen in quiet moments before dawn. Here, silence was everything. At first, it unnerved her. She found herself jumping at small sounds. The pop of a log in the fire, the cry of a hawk overhead, the distant lowing of cattle. Every noise seemed amplified in the vast emptiness of this place. But slowly, gradually, she began to find a strange comfort in it. The silence was not empty. It was full of things she had never had time to notice before. The whisper of wind through the prairie grass, the rhythm of Caleb's hammer striking metal in the barn, the soft cluck of chickens in their coop. She learned to read this new world through its sounds rather than its words. And she learned to read Caleb the same way. He was not a cruel man. That much became clear within the first few days. He did not raise his voice. He did not raise his hand. He did not look at her with the contempt or disappointment she had expected. He simply existed alongside her, like two trees growing in the same field, close enough to share the soil, far enough apart that their branches never touched. Her hands grew rough with labor. Cooking on an open hearth was different from anything she had done before. The fire was temperamental. The pot hung at an awkward angle. She burned her fingers more times than she could count in those first weeks. Bread burned. Stew turned out too salty or too bland. Biscuits came out hard as rocks or flat as paper. Every night she placed the food before him and waited for the inevitable criticism. Her father had never hesitated to point out her failures. Her mother had taught her through sharp words and sharper looks. But Caleb ate everything she made. Every burned biscuit, every oversalted stew, every loaf of bread that could have doubled as a doorstop. He ate it all without a single word of complaint. She did not know if it was patience or indifference. She could not tell if he was being kind or if he simply did not care enough to comment. The silence between them remained vast and unreadable. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after her arrival, Evelyn was preparing the evening meal. She had been trying to make a simple fried cornmeal cake. Her mother used to make them on special occasions, and Evelyn had been craving that taste of home. The skillet was cast iron and heavy. She had heated it over the fire until it was properly hot, just as she had watched her mother do countless times. But she had not accounted for how different this fire was, how much hotter it burned, how much faster things went wrong. When she reached for the handle to adjust the skillet's position, she forgot to grab the cloth she had set aside for exactly that purpose. Her bare hand wrapped around the cast iron handle. The pain was instant and blinding. She cried out before she could stop herself, a sharp, involuntary sound of agony. The skillet clattered to the hearth, spilling cornmeal batter into the ashes. She clutched her hand to her chest, her eyes watering, her breath coming in gasps. The burn was bad. She could already see the angry red welt rising across her palm. The skin had blistered almost immediately. She stood there shaking, trying to blink back the tears that wanted to fall. She was angry at herself, angry for being careless, angry for being weak, angry for crying over something so stupid. She did not hear the door open. She did not hear him approach. She only knew he was there when his hand gently took hold of her wrist. She flinched at the touch. Instinct. A lifetime of learning that hands reaching for you usually meant pain was coming. But his grip was light, careful. He turned her palm upward and examined the burn with those pale blue eyes that never seemed to give anything away. Then, without a word, he led her to the water barrel by the door. He held her hand under the cool water. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. She let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. He did not speak. He simply stood there, holding her hand in the water, waiting for the initial shock of the burn to fade. After several minutes, he led her to the table and sat her down. He went to a shelf above the wash basin and took down a small tin. Inside was a pale yellow salve that smelled of herbs and animal fat. He returned to her side and knelt down. He took her injured hand in both of his and, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for hands so large and calloused, he spread the salve across the burn. Then he wrapped her palm with a clean strip of cloth. He tied it off neatly, not too tight, not too loose. The practiced ease of someone who had tended his own wounds many times before. When he was finished, he stood up. He looked down at her for a long moment. He did not scold her for being careless. He did not lecture her about fire safety. He did not remind her that burned hands meant she could not do her work properly. He simply gave a small nod and went back outside. The whole exchange had taken perhaps 10 minutes. He had not spoken a single word. But Evelyn sat at that table for a long time afterward, cradling her bandaged hand against her chest. She was thinking about his touch. How gentle it had been. How careful. She was thinking about the way he had known exactly what to do. The water first, to stop the burning. The salve second, to help it heal. The bandage third, to protect it. She was thinking about all the things that simple act of care had told her about this silent man. He was not indifferent. He could not be indifferent and yet be so careful. He noticed things. He had noticed her cry of pain from outside the cabin. He had noticed the burn the moment he saw it. He had noticed exactly how to help. He cared, in his own quiet way, in his own unspoken language. He cared. That small act stayed with her long after the pain faded. The silence between them began to change after that day. It was still there, still vast, but it no longer felt empty. Evelyn started to pay closer attention to the things Caleb did instead of the things he said, and she began to realize that he had been speaking to her all along. She had just been listening for the wrong language. When she woke in the mornings, the fire was always already burning. He must have risen before dawn to build it up so the cabin would be warm when she got out of bed. When she went to gather eggs, the path from the cabin to the chicken coop was always clear. He must have swept away the rocks and smoothed the dirt so she would not trip in the dim light of early morning. When she struggled to carry the heavy water buckets from the well, she would often return to find them already filled and waiting by the door. He must have done it himself to save her the strain. These were not grand gestures. These were not words of love or declarations of affection. But they were something. They were care, expressed in the only language this silent man seemed to know. One evening, about a month after her arrival, Evelyn was mending a tear in one of his work shirts. The light from the oil lamp cast a warm glow across the table. Caleb sat across from her, working a piece of leather into a new strap for the plow harness. They worked in their usual silence. But it felt different now, companionable, almost peaceful. She glanced up from her sewing and noticed something she had not seen before. There was a long, thin scar on the back of his right hand. It ran from his knuckle to his wrist, pale against his tanned skin. Without thinking, she spoke. Her voice sounded strange after so many hours of quiet. She asked him how he got the scar. He looked up, surprised perhaps to hear her speak. His blue eyes met hers for a moment. Then he looked back down at his work. He said it was a wolf. Years ago, he had been protecting a calf, that was all. 3 short sentences, but it was more than he had ever shared about himself before. Evelyn felt something warm bloom in her chest. A small victory, a tiny crack in the fortress of his silence. She went back to her mending. She did not push for more, but she filed that information away. A wolf. Years ago, protecting a calf. This man who seemed made of stone had once fought a wolf to save a baby animal. This man who seemed to feel nothing had scars from battles fought in defense of something helpless. The silence fell between them again. But it was different now. It was not empty. It was not cold. It was simply the quiet space between two people who were slowly, carefully, beginning to learn each other's language. Later that night, as Caleb spread his blanket on the floor and Evelyn settled into the bed, she found herself thinking about her mother. Her mother had always said that a man shows who he truly is not by what he says, but by what he does. Words are cheap, her mother would say. Any fool can make promises. Watch his hands. Watch his feet. Watch where he puts his time and his sweat and his care. That is where the truth lives. Evelyn had not understood those words when she was young. She was beginning to understand them now. Caleb Thorne was not a man of words. He was a man of actions. And his actions, she was beginning to see, spoke volumes. As sleep began to pull her under, she made a decision. She would stop waiting for him to speak. She would stop listening for words that might never come. Instead, she would watch. She would pay attention. She would learn to read this strange, silent language he spoke with his hands and his deeds. And maybe, if she was patient enough, she would begin to understand the man she had married. The wind outside had softened. It no longer sounded like a mournful cry. It sounded almost like a lullaby. Spring came to the prairie slowly, like a shy guest unsure of its welcome. The brown grass began to show hints of green. The endless gray sky gave way to patches of pale blue. The wind still blew, but it carried warmth now instead of bitter cold. With spring came more work than Evelyn had ever imagined. Caleb was gone from before dawn until well after dark, plowing, planting, mending fences that the winter had damaged. The land demanded everything from him, and he gave it willingly. Evelyn found her own rhythm in the chaos. She learned which herbs grew wild on the prairie and could be used for medicine or seasoning. She learned how to coax the most stubborn hens into laying. She learned how to stretch their supplies so nothing went to waste. She was becoming a farmer's wife, not just in name, but in truth. One morning, Caleb appeared at the cabin door while she was kneading bread. This was unusual. He rarely came back once he had left for the day. He told her to get her shawl. Then he said they were going to town. Town was a generous word for what lay 8 miles to the east. It was really just a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a single muddy street. A general store, a blacksmith, a tiny church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a saloon that Evelyn had been warned about by a neighbor woman but had never seen herself. She had not been to town since her arrival. There had been no need, and truthfully, she had not wanted to face the curious stares of strangers. But Caleb needed supplies: seed for the spring planting, a new blade for his plow, salt and flour and coffee, things the land could not provide. So she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and climbed onto the wagon seat beside him. It was the first time they had sat this close since her arrival. She was acutely aware of the warmth of him beside her, the solid bulk of his shoulder nearly touching hers, the way his hands held the reins with easy confidence. They did not speak during the long ride, but the silence felt different out here, under the open sky. It felt companionable rather than empty. When they reached town, people stared. Evelyn felt their eyes on her like physical weight. Women whispered behind their hands. Men paused in their work to watch the wagon pass. She understood. She was new. She was Caleb Thorne's mail-order bride. She was the girl who had been purchased to fill an empty cabin and warm an empty bed. The speculation must have been endless. She kept her eyes forward and her chin high. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her shame. Caleb drove the wagon to the general store and helped her down. His hand was warm and steady under her elbow. He did not seem to notice the stares, or perhaps he simply did not care. Inside the store, he collected the supplies he needed with the efficiency of a man who had done this 100 times before. He spoke to the shopkeeper in short, clipped sentences: seeds, blade, salt, flour, coffee. Evelyn wandered through the small store while he conducted his business. She had no money of her own. She had nothing to buy, even if she did. But it was nice to see bolts of fabric and jars of penny candy, and all the small luxuries that prairie life did not allow. She was examining a bolt of blue fabric when she sensed Caleb beside her. She looked up, startled. He was looking at the fabric. Then he was looking at her. His expression gave nothing away. He turned to the shopkeeper and said he would take 3 yards of the blue. Evelyn's breath caught. She tried to protest. She said he did not have to do that. She said she did not need it. She said her dress was fine. He did not argue. He simply paid for the fabric along with the rest of the supplies. When they left the store, he handed her the wrapped bundle without ceremony. He did not explain. He did not wait for thanks. He just loaded the wagon and drove her home. That night, after dinner, Evelyn sat at the table and unwrapped the blue fabric. She ran her fingers over the soft cotton. It was the color of the sky on a clear spring day, the color of wildflowers that grew along the creek bed, the color of Caleb's eyes. She did not know if that was intentional. She suspected it was not. He did not seem like a man who thought about such things. But it touched her anyway. The idea that he had seen her admiring something beautiful and had simply given it to her without being asked. She began to sew that night. She worked by lamplight until her eyes ached. She worked the next night and the next and the next. She was making a dress, not a practical dress for work on the farm, but a beautiful dress. A dress that made her feel like something other than a debt settled. When it was finished, she held it up in the lamplight and felt tears prick her eyes. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever owned. She wore the blue dress to town 3 weeks later. Caleb had another trip to make for supplies, and she asked if she could come along. He nodded without comment. When she climbed onto the wagon seat in her new dress, she saw something flicker across his face. It was gone before she could name it, but she thought it might have been approval. In town, people stared again. But this time, Evelyn did not feel their eyes as judgment. She felt them as confirmation. She was no longer the frightened girl who had arrived in a dusty wool dress with nothing but a canvas satchel. She was a woman in a beautiful blue dress, a woman who had made something with her own hands, a woman who belonged. The whispers still followed her through the streets. She could hear fragments as she walked. People wondered about the silent man and his purchased bride. They speculated about what happened behind the closed doors of that lonely cabin on the prairie. Let them wonder, she thought, let them speculate. They did not know anything about her life or her husband. When they finished their shopping, they walked past the small bakery that doubled as the town's only restaurant. The smell of fresh bread and something sweet wafted through the open door. Evelyn paused without meaning to. She breathed in the scent and remembered her mother's kitchen. Sunday mornings, special occasions, the rare, precious treat of something sweet. Caleb stopped beside her. He looked at the bakery. Then he looked at her. He went inside without a word. When he came back out, he was carrying a small, paper-wrapped parcel. He handed it to her. She opened it to find a honey cake, small and golden and still warm from the oven. She looked up at him. She could feel tears threatening again. She said, "Thank you." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. He nodded. Then he placed his hand at the small of her back and guided her toward the wagon. It was the first time he had touched her since bandaging her burned hand. The warmth of his palm seemed to burn through the fabric of her new blue dress. She did not flinch away. They ate the honey cake on the wagon ride home. She broke it in half and offered him his share. He took it without comment. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. As they drove across the prairie, the late afternoon sun turning the grass to gold, Evelyn smiled. It was the first time she had smiled in longer than she could remember. Caleb glanced at her. She caught the look from the corner of her eye. He did not smile back. His face remained as unreadable as ever. But there was something in his eyes, something that had not been there before, something that looked almost like hope. That night, as she lay in bed and listened to his steady breathing from his blanket on the floor, Evelyn thought about the day, the blue fabric, the dress she had made, the honey cake, the warmth of his hand on her back. These were small things, tiny kindnesses that most people would overlook, but they were not small to her. They were everything. She was beginning to understand something important about Caleb Thorne. He did not speak because he did not know how. Words were not his language. They never had been. But he was not silent. Not really. He spoke through the fire he built every morning before she woke. He spoke through the path he cleared to the chicken coop. He spoke through the water buckets he filled so she would not have to carry them. He spoke through blue fabric and honey cakes and the gentle pressure of his hand on her back. He was speaking to her all the time. She had just needed to learn how to listen. As sleep began to claim her, Evelyn made another decision. She would speak back, not in the language of words which seemed to make him uncomfortable, but in the language of actions, which he understood so well. She would show him care the way he showed her, through deeds, through attention, through the 1,000 small kindnesses that made up a life shared. She did not know what this marriage was going to become. She did not know if love was even possible between two people who had been thrown together by circumstance rather than choice. But she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer afraid of Caleb Thorne, and that, she thought, was a start. Summer arrived with a vengeance. The gentle warmth of spring gave way to a relentless, punishing heat that seemed to press down on the land like a physical weight. The work doubled, then tripled. The crops needed tending. The animals needed extra water. The garden Evelyn had planted required constant attention to survive the scorching sun. She threw herself into the labor with everything she had. She was determined to be useful, to be valuable, to be worthy of the blue fabric and the honey cakes and all the small kindnesses Caleb had shown her. She worked from dawn until well past dark. She ignored the ache in her muscles and the blisters on her hands. She ignored the way her head sometimes swam from the heat. She ignored the warning signs her body tried to send her. She pushed and pushed and pushed because that was what she had always done. That was how she had survived her whole life. But survival has its limits. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. The sun was at its peak, beating down on the garden with merciless intensity. Evelyn was bent over the tomato plants, pulling weeds that seemed to grow back as fast as she could remove them. She had been working since before dawn. She had not eaten since the night before. She had not drunk nearly enough water. The first warning was a slight graying at the edges of her vision. She blinked it away and kept working. The second warning was a ringing in her ears, high and distant like church bells heard from far away. She shook her head to clear it and kept working. The third warning was the ground rushing up to meet her face. She did not remember falling. She did not remember crying out. The next thing she knew, she was in Caleb's arms. He was carrying her across the yard toward the cabin. His face was tight with something she had never seen before. Fear, she realized dimly. He was afraid. She tried to speak. She wanted to tell him she was fine. She wanted to apologize for being weak, but the words would not come. The world kept tilting and spinning around her. Then she was lying on the bed. The quilt was cool against her overheated skin. A wet cloth was pressed to her forehead. Caleb's face swam above her. His blue eyes were darker than she had ever seen them. He told her to drink. A cup was pressed to her lips. She swallowed the cool water obediently, one small sip at a time. She tried to sit up. She needed to get back to work. The garden needed her. The weeds would not pull themselves. His hand pressed gently against her shoulder. He said to stay. The single word was a command. But there was something underneath it. Something that sounded almost like pleading. She stayed. For the rest of that day and all of the next, Caleb would not let her leave the bed except to use the necessary. He brought her water every hour. He made her eat broth and bread even when she said she was not hungry. He sat beside the bed and watched her with those unreadable blue eyes. On the second evening, when she was finally feeling strong enough to sit up without the world spinning, she asked him a question. She asked him why he was doing this. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he asked her what she meant. She said she meant all of it, the water, the food, the refusal to let her work. She was his wife in name only. She was here to cook his meals and clean his cabin and warm his bed when he finally decided to claim that right. She was not worth this kind of care. As soon as the words left her mouth, she wished she could take them back. They sounded bitter and self-pitying. They sounded like the words of a woman who expected nothing good from the world, which, she supposed, was exactly what she was. Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke. His voice was low and rough, as if the words were being dragged out of him against his will. He said she was wrong. He said she was worth more than she knew. He said a cabin was just a building without someone to fill it. And she had filled his. Then he stood up and walked out of the cabin without looking back. Evelyn sat in the fading light and felt something crack open inside her chest. It was not pain. Not exactly. It was something more like hope. Fragile and frightening and impossible to ignore. That night she lay awake for a long time. She heard Caleb come back inside. She heard him spread his blanket on the floor. She heard his breathing slow and deepen as sleep claimed him. But she could not sleep. She kept hearing his words over and over again. She was worth more than she knew. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. Her father had told her she was a burden. Her mother had told her she was useful. Her siblings had told her she was bossy and too serious. No one had ever suggested that she had worth simply because she existed, simply because she filled a space that had been empty. It was terrifying, because if she let herself believe it, If she let herself hope for something more than survival, she would have something to lose. And losing things hurt. She had learned that lesson young and learned it well. But as the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the window, Evelyn made a choice. She chose to hope anyway. It might hurt. It probably would hurt. Nothing good in her life had ever come without a price, but she was tired of protecting herself from pain by refusing to feel anything at all. She wanted to feel. She wanted to hope. She wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, this life she had dreaded might become something beautiful. She got out of bed quietly, careful not to wake him. She built up the fire. She started the coffee. She began preparing breakfast. When Caleb woke and saw her moving around the cabin, he frowned. He said she should be resting. She said she was fine. She said she wanted to take care of him for a change. Something shifted in his expression. Something she could not name. He sat down at the table and let her serve him breakfast. And when their eyes met across the table, Evelyn felt something pass between them. Something unspoken but real. An understanding. A beginning. A choice made by two people who had been thrown together by fate but were now, slowly, choosing each other. The summer heat continued to press down on the land. But inside the cabin, something had changed. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of all the things they were learning to say without words. And for the first time since she had arrived on this prairie, Evelyn began to believe that she might actually be happy here. The storm came in fast, darkening the sky from pale blue to angry gray in the space of an hour. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing down on the land like a held breath. Evelyn was in the cabin preparing dinner when she heard the sound. It was coming from the barn, a distressed, almost human cry that sent chills down her spine. She knew that sound. Their milk cow, Bessie, was in labor, but something was wrong. The calf was not due for another 2 weeks. Evelyn ran to the door and looked out. The sky was dark with approaching rain. Lightning flickered in the distance. Caleb was far out on the property, checking the fence line on the eastern edge of their land. He would not be back for hours. And Bessie could not wait hours. Fear wrapped tight around Evelyn's chest as she ran toward the barn. The wind was picking up, whipping her skirts around her legs, pulling strands of hair free from her braid. Inside the barn, Bessie was down on her side, her brown eyes rolling with pain and fear. The sounds coming from her were terrible. The sounds of an animal in distress who did not understand why her body was betraying her. Evelyn knelt beside her and assessed the situation with the quick, practical eye her mother had taught her. The calf was coming wrong. She could see that immediately. It was positioned badly, and Bessie's labor was not progressing the way it should. She had helped with birthings before. On her family's small farm, every pair of hands was needed when animals gave birth. She had seen calves born. She had seen them die, too, when things went wrong and there was no help to be had. She knew what needed to be done. She just was not sure she could do it. Her hands shook as she removed her apron and rolled up her sleeves. She cleaned her arms in the bucket of water by the door. She spoke softly to Bessie. Nonsense words meant to soothe, though her own voice trembled. Then she went to work. It was brutal. There was no other word for it. She had to reach inside and reposition the calf. She had to work against Bessie's contractions, fighting the animal's body to save both mother and baby. Sweat poured down her face. Her muscles screamed with effort. Her arms ached from the strain. Outside, the storm broke. Rain hammered against the barn roof like fists. Thunder shook the walls. Lightning turned the world white for split seconds at a time. Evelyn did not notice any of it. All her attention was focused on the task in front of her, on the life she was trying to save, on the work her hands were doing. She thought of her mother. She thought of Caleb. She thought of all the times she had been told she was not strong enough, not good enough, not capable enough. She pushed those voices aside and kept working. The barn door flew open. Caleb stood in the doorway, soaked to the bone, rain streaming down his face. He must have seen the storm coming and raced back. He must have run all the way from the far fence. He took one look at the scene before him and went still. Evelyn did not look up. She could not afford to lose focus. She said she had it. Her voice came out stronger than she expected. Then she said she needed him to hold Bessie's head. He moved without question. He knelt at the cow's head and wrapped his arms around her neck, holding her steady, giving Evelyn the stability she needed to finish what she had started. They worked in silence. Two people moving in perfect coordination without needing words. And then, finally, blessedly, the calf slid free. It was small, too small. Its sides heaved weakly, but it was breathing. It was alive. Evelyn fell back onto the hay, exhausted beyond words. Her arms were covered in blood and fluid. Her hair had come completely loose from its braid. She was shaking from head to toe. But the calf was alive. And Bessie was already lifting her head, already reaching to clean her baby with her tongue. Caleb stood slowly. He looked at the calf. He looked at Bessie. Then he looked at Evelyn. His eyes were different. She had never seen them look like this before. There was something in them that made her breath catch, something that looked like awe. He reached down and offered her his hand. She took it. He pulled her to her feet and steadied her when she swayed. He said she had done well. 3 simple words, but they landed in her chest like a physical blow. Then he said her name. Evelyn. It was the first time he had ever spoken it. Not Mrs. Thorne, not woman, not wife. Evelyn. Her name, in his voice, sounded like something precious. She felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back. She said his name in return. Caleb. Something passed between them in that moment. Something that neither of them had words for. An acknowledgement, a recognition, a turning point. They stood there in the barn. The storm raging outside, the newborn calf crying weakly beside them, and something fundamental shifted in their relationship. She was no longer just the woman who cooked his meals and cleaned his cabin. She was Evelyn. And he saw her, truly saw her, for the first time. Later, after they had dried off and changed clothes and eaten a cold dinner because neither of them had energy to cook, Evelyn sat by the fire and tried to process what had happened. Caleb was outside, checking on Bessie and the calf one more time before bed. When he came back in, he did not immediately reach for his blanket. Instead, he sat down in the chair across from her. He said she had saved them, the cow and the calf both. She said she had just done what needed doing. He shook his head. He said it was more than that. He said most people would have waited, would have been too scared, would have let nature take its course even if that course meant death. She had not waited. She had not been too scared. She had acted. He said that took courage. Evelyn did not know what to say. No one had ever called her courageous before. Finally, she spoke. She said she had learned to act because waiting never saved anything. Where she came from, you did what needed doing or you went without. There was no one else to do it for you. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said they had that in common. It was the most personal thing he had ever shared with her. She wanted to ask more. She wanted to know about his past, about the life he had lived before she arrived, about what had shaped him into this silent, stoic man. But she did not push. She had learned that pushing did not work with Caleb. Instead, she simply nodded. She said she was glad she was here. The words surprised her even as she said them, but they were true. Despite everything, despite the fear and the uncertainty and the strangeness of this life, she was glad. Something flickered in his eyes, that same something she had seen in the barn. He said he was glad too. Then he reached for his blanket and spread it on the floor, same as every other night. But before he lay down, he looked at her one more time. He said, "Good night, Evelyn." She said, "Good night, Caleb." And somehow those simple words felt like a promise of what she did not yet know. But for the first time since her arrival, she was not afraid to find out. The weeks after the storm were the best of Evelyn's life. Something had changed between her and Caleb. The wall that had stood between them, invisible but immovable, had begun to crack. He spoke her name now, not often, not casually, but when he did, it felt like a gift. She learned to read his moods better. She knew when he needed silence and when he needed company. She knew which foods he preferred and which he ate only out of politeness. She knew that he hummed under his breath when he was working on something difficult, a tuneless sound that she had come to find comforting. He learned things about her, too. He learned that she liked to sing while she worked, old songs her mother had taught her. He learned that she was afraid of spiders, but not of snakes. He learned that she cried sometimes at night when she thought he was asleep, though he never mentioned it. They were becoming partners, not just in the work of the farm, but in the quiet rhythms of daily life. It was not love, not yet. Evelyn was not even sure she knew what love felt like. But it was something real and growing. And then they went to town. It was an ordinary trip, supplies needed, business to attend to, nothing unusual. But this time, while Caleb was at the blacksmith discussing a repair, Evelyn found herself alone outside the general store. Two women stood nearby. They did not seem to notice her, or perhaps they simply did not care. Their voices carried clearly in the still morning air. The first woman said she heard the Thorne bride was strange, quiet, kept to herself like she was too good for regular folk. The second woman laughed. She said, "What did you expect from a mail-order bride? A woman desperate enough to sell herself to a stranger?" There had to be something wrong with her. The first woman lowered her voice, but not enough. She said she heard he still slept on the floor, every night, like a dog. Her cousin's boy worked on a neighboring farm and had heard it from someone who knew. The second woman gasped dramatically. She said that meant the marriage was not real, not truly. A man did not sleep on the floor unless he did not want his wife, unless he found her so repulsive he could not bear to share a bed with her. They laughed together, a mean, knowing laugh. The first woman said perhaps that was why she was sold so cheap. Perhaps her own family knew she was unmarriageable. Evelyn stood frozen. The words washed over her like ice water. She had known people would talk. She had expected curiosity and speculation. But this was different. This was cruel. This was taking the one kindness Caleb had shown her, the choice and the space and the respect, and turning it into something shameful. She turned and walked away before they could see her. She walked past the blacksmith shop without stopping. She walked all the way to the edge of town, to a grove of cottonwood trees by a small creek, before she let herself cry. The tears came hard and fast. All the insecurities she had tried to bury came flooding back. She was not a real wife. The whole town knew it. They laughed about it behind their hands and pitied the silent man who was stuck with a woman so worthless he could not even bring himself to touch her. Maybe they were right. Maybe there was something wrong with her. Maybe she was unlovable. Maybe she had been foolish to hope for anything more than survival. By the time Caleb found her, her tears had dried, but the damage was done. He looked at her with concern in his eyes. He asked if something had happened. She shook her head. She said she was fine. She said she was ready to go home. He did not believe her. She could see it in the way he studied her face. But he did not push. He simply helped her into the wagon and drove them home in silence. That night, Evelyn could not eat. She picked at her food and pushed it around her plate until Caleb finally took it away. He sat down across from her. He waited. She knew he would wait all night, if necessary. He was patient that way. Finally, in a voice that barely rose above a whisper, she told him what she had heard. She told him about the women, about the whispers, about the pity and the mockery. She told him that the whole town knew he slept on the floor, that they thought it meant he did not want her, that she was unwanted and unworthy, and nothing but a burden he had been tricked into taking. When she finished, she could not look at him. The silence stretched between them, longer and heavier than any silence they had shared before. Then Caleb did something unexpected. He reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was rough and warm against hers. His grip was gentle but firm. He asked her if she believed what those women said. She tried to pull her hand away. She said it did not matter what she believed. The whole town was laughing at them. He held on. He said he did not care what the town thought. He asked again, "Did she believe it?" She looked up at him then. His blue eyes were darker than she had ever seen them. There was something burning in their depths, something fierce. She said she did not know what to believe anymore. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that shattered every wall she had left. He said he slept on the floor because she deserved choice. He said she had been sold like property and brought to a stranger against her will. He said the least he could do was not force himself on her like she was something he had bought. He said he slept on the floor because he respected her. He said he slept on the floor because she was worth waiting for. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. No one had ever waited for her. No one had ever respected her enough to give her time. The tears came again, but they were different this time. They were not tears of shame or sorrow. They were tears of something she had forgotten she knew how to feel. Caleb squeezed her hand once, then let go. He said he would understand if she wanted to leave. He said he would give her money and a horse and set her free if that was what she wanted. He would not hold her against her will. But he said he hoped she would stay. He said the cabin had been empty before she came. Just walls and a roof and nothing else. He said she had made it a home. Evelyn sat in the fading light and felt something break open inside her. Not break apart, break open. Like a seed breaking through soil to reach the sun. She did not want to leave. She wanted to stay. Here in this cabin, with this silent man who showed his love through actions rather than words. She wanted to stay and see what they could build together. She looked at Caleb across the table. She looked at the face she had once feared and now found familiar, comforting, dear. She said she was staying. She said she wanted to stay. Something shifted in his expression, a softening she had never seen before. He nodded once. Then he stood and went to spread his blanket on the floor. But before he lay down, he looked back at her. He said, "Good night, Evelyn." Then he said he would see her in the morning. It was a small thing, a simple thing, but it felt like a promise of all the mornings to come. For a few weeks, everything was better. Evelyn stopped hiding from the townspeople. She held her head high when she walked down the street. She smiled at the whispering women and pretended she did not hear their cruel words. Caleb stood beside her through all of it. His presence was a steady anchor. His hand at the small of her back was a silent declaration. She was his wife. He was her husband. And whatever anyone else thought about their arrangement, they were building something real. But old wounds do not heal overnight. And old fears have a way of creeping back when you least expect them. It happened on a night when Caleb was gone. A neighbor's fence had fallen in a storm, and they had asked for help rebuilding it. Caleb had ridden out after dinner and would not be back until late. Evelyn was alone in the cabin for the first time in months. The silence felt different without him. Emptier. The shadows seemed darker. She tried to keep busy. She mended clothes, she swept floors, she organized the pantry, but no matter what she did, she could not escape her own thoughts. The women's words kept echoing in her mind, the laughter, the pity, the certainty that she was nothing but a burden. She thought about all the things Caleb had done for her, the blue fabric, the honey cake, the water he carried and the fires he built, and the 1,000 small kindnesses he had shown. What had she done for him? She cooked meals that were barely edible. She cleaned a cabin he had managed fine without her. She was learning the work of the farm, but she was still more burden than help. He deserved better. He deserved a real wife, someone who could give him children, someone the town respected, someone who had not been sold to him like livestock. The thoughts spiraled darker and darker. By midnight, Evelyn had convinced herself of the truth. She was holding him back. She was a weight around his neck. He was too kind to say it, but she knew. She knew what she had to do. With shaking hands, she found paper and pen. She sat at the table by the dying firelight and began to write. She wrote that she was sorry. She wrote that he deserved better. She wrote that she was releasing him from their arrangement. She wrote that he should not look for her. She wrote that this was her choice. She wrote goodbye. Then she packed her small canvas satchel, the same one she had arrived with all those months ago, and slipped out into the night. She did not make it far. The barn was dark and quiet. She was trying to saddle the horse, her hands clumsy with grief and exhaustion, when the door opened behind her. Caleb stood in the doorway. He was breathing hard. He must have ridden home at full speed when something, instinct perhaps, told him something was wrong. He looked at the satchel on the ground. He looked at the half-saddled horse. Then he looked at her. She expected anger. She expected coldness. She expected the fortress to slam shut and lock her out forever. Instead, she saw something she had never seen on his face before. Fear. Raw, naked fear. He walked toward her slowly. Like she was a wild animal he was afraid of spooking. He asked where she was going. She could not speak. The tears were choking her. He asked again, his voice cracking on the words. She showed him the letter. Her hand shook as she held it out. He took it. He read it by the moonlight streaming through the barn door. When he finished, he crushed the paper in his fist. He said she was wrong. She shook her head. She said she was not wrong. She said she was broken. She said she was worthless. She said he deserved a real wife, not a debt settled. He said her name, Evelyn. She could not stop the words now. They poured out of her like water through a broken dam. She said she had never been good enough. Not for her family, not for anyone. She said she was damaged goods. She said she had been sold because no one else would have her. She said she was doing him a favor by leaving. Caleb listened to all of it, every terrible word. Then he closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He took her face in his hands. His palms were warm against her tear-stained cheeks. He said he did not want perfect. He said he wanted her. He said she was not broken. She was strong. She was brave. She had saved a calf with her bare hands. She had faced a new life with courage. She had turned a cold cabin into a warm home. He said if she left, the home would leave with her. He said he was choosing her, not because of duty, not because of the coins he had paid, not because of any arrangement. He said he was choosing her because she was Evelyn, and that was enough. Evelyn stared up at him. His face was so close she could see the individual flecks of darker blue in his pale eyes. She said she did not know how to be loved. He said they could learn together. Then slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head and pressed his lips to her forehead. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of promise. A promise that she was wanted. A promise that she was chosen. A promise that she was home. Evelyn collapsed against his chest. His arms wrapped around her and held her tight. She cried into his shirt for a long time. All the grief and fear and self-hatred she had been carrying for 19 years poured out of her in waves. He held her through all of it. When the tears finally stopped, he led her back to the cabin. The fire had burned down to embers. The room was cool and dim. He built up the fire. He made her drink water. He took the crumpled letter and threw it into the flames. They watched it burn together. Then he turned to her. He asked if she would stay. She said yes. He asked if she was sure. She said she had never been more sure of anything. He nodded once. Then he walked to the bed. Not to his blanket on the floor. To the bed. He lay down on top of the quilt, still fully dressed. He held out his hand. She took it. She lay down beside him. Not touching. Not yet. But close enough to feel the warmth of him. He did not ask for anything more. He did not push. He simply lay there, holding her hand in the darkness, letting her know she was not alone. They fell asleep like that, side by side, hands intertwined. And when Evelyn woke the next morning, she realized something had fundamentally changed. She was not afraid anymore, not of the town, not of the future, not of being unworthy. She was afraid of nothing except losing this man who had chosen her when she could not even choose herself. And she was never going to let that happen. 3 weeks later, Caleb asked Evelyn to marry him. She laughed when he said it. They were already married. What more was there to do? But his face was serious. He said their first marriage had been a transaction. It had been about debts and desperation and survival. He said he wanted a real wedding, one that was about them, one that was about choice. He said he wanted to stand up in front of God and witnesses and choose her on purpose. Evelyn's laughter died in her throat. She said yes before he finished speaking. The wedding was small, the smallest wedding the town had ever seen. They stood outside the cabin on a clear September morning. The sky was the palest blue, stretching endless and clean above the prairie. The grass had turned golden with the coming fall. The preacher came from town. He was an old man with kind eyes who did not ask questions. 2 neighbors stood as witnesses, a husband and wife from the farm to the south who had shown Evelyn kindness when others had offered only whispers. Evelyn wore her blue dress, the one she had made from the fabric Caleb had bought her all those months ago. She had added small white flowers to the hem, embroidered by hand over many late nights. Caleb wore his cleanest shirt. His hair was neatly combed. His jaw was freshly shaved. He looked at her like she was the sunrise, like she was the first good thing he had seen in years. The preacher spoke the old words, the familiar words, words about love and honor and partnership. When it was time for the vows, Caleb surprised everyone. He pulled 2 small rings from his pocket. They were braided from thread, brown and blue, earth and sky. He had made them himself. He slipped the blue one onto her finger as he spoke. He said he promised to choose her every day. He promised to show her love through actions when words failed him. He promised to build a life with her that was worth living. Evelyn slipped the brown ring onto his finger. She said she promised to stay. She promised to trust him. She promised to learn love with him, one day at a time. The preacher pronounced them married, husband and wife, for real this time. Caleb kissed her then, not on the forehead, on the lips. It was gentle and warm and over too quickly, but it was a beginning. Evelyn looked at the simple braided ring on her finger. It was not gold, it was not precious, but it was the most valuable thing she had ever owned, because it meant she was chosen. Not bought, not sold, not traded. Chosen. That night, Caleb did not reach for his blanket. He climbed into bed beside his wife, his real wife. They lay in the darkness, hands intertwined, just as they had been 3 weeks before. But this time, when he turned to her, there was a question in his eyes. She answered it by moving closer. What happened next was gentle and sweet, and nothing like the horror stories she had feared. It was awkward at times. They were both learning, both uncertain. But it was also tender, patient, full of the same quiet care Caleb had shown her from the very beginning. When it was over, he held her close. She pressed her ear to his chest and listened to his heartbeat. She said she loved him. The words came out before she could stop them, before she could worry about whether they were too much too soon. But Caleb did not seem surprised. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. He said he loved her too. He said he had loved her since the day she saved the calf. Maybe before that. Maybe since the first moment she stepped off that dusty carriage and looked at him with those terrified, defiant eyes. Evelyn laughed softly. She said she had been too scared to be defiant. He said that was what made it brave. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, no blanket on the floor, no distance between them. Just 2 people who had found each other against all odds. 2 people who had chosen each other when the world said they should not. 2 people who were finally, beautifully, completely home. The years that followed were not always easy. The prairie was harsh. The work was endless. There were storms that destroyed crops and winters that seemed like they would never end. But they faced it all together. Caleb learned to use his words more. Not many, but enough. He told her when he was worried. He told her when he was proud. He told her every morning and every night that he loved her. Evelyn learned to believe she was worthy of love. It took time. Old wounds left deep scars, but slowly, day by day, she healed. They had children, 2 daughters and a son born over the span of 8 years. Evelyn taught them to read. Caleb taught them to work the land. Together they taught them what love looked like. Not grand gestures or pretty words, but steady presence, daily kindness, choosing each other again and again. The cabin grew over the years. They added rooms as the family expanded. What had once been a small, lonely house became a warm, crowded home full of laughter and noise. The whispers in town faded. People saw the Thorne family thrive. They saw the children grow strong and happy. They saw Caleb look at his wife like she hung the moon. The rumors about the mail-order bride and the man who slept on the floor became just another forgotten story. One evening, many years after that first dusty carriage ride, Evelyn stood at the window of her kitchen and watched the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of gold and pink. The prairie grass rippled in the gentle wind like waves on a golden sea. Caleb came up behind her. His hair had gray in it now. His face had more lines than before. But his eyes were the same, pale blue, clear as winter sky. He wrapped his arms around her waist and rested his chin on her shoulder. He asked what she was thinking about. She said she was thinking about the girl she used to be, the frightened girl on the carriage, the girl who thought she was being sold into a life of misery. He asked if she ever wished things had been different. She turned in his arms to face him. She said no. She said if things had been different, she might never have found him. She might never have learned what love really meant. She said she would ride in that dusty carriage 1,000 times if it always led her here, to this cabin, to this family, to him. Caleb smiled. It was still rare, that smile, but she had learned to treasure it. He said he felt the same. He said she had turned his whole life into something worth living. He said thank you. She kissed him then, a kiss that held decades of love and partnership and gratitude. When she pulled back, she was smiling too. She said they should go inside. Dinner was ready. The children were waiting. He nodded. But before he let her go, he said her name one more time. Evelyn. The way he said it still made her heart flutter, even after all these years. She said his name back. Caleb. Then they walked into their warm, bright home together. The wind outside had softened. It no longer howled with menace. It whispered instead, carrying the scent of the land and the promise of tomorrow. And Evelyn Thorne, once a girl sold to settle a debt, knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. She was home, she was loved, she was enough, and that was everything. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.